When Aloan stepped into the glittering chaos of the mating ball, her heart hammered with a mix of dread and defiance. She had come here for one reckless reason, a night of passion before her Uncle Bram sold her to the highest bidder. But as the masked stranger pulled her into the shadowed corridors, his touch igniting fires she had never known, she had no idea the man claiming her was the very Alpha King she had sworn to hate. Aloan's fingers trembled as she adjusted the simple silver mask over her eyes, the cool metal a sharp contrast to the heat already rising in her cheeks. The grand hall of Eldritha's neutral territory pulsed with music and the low thrum of nobles in their finest silks and leathers, scents mingled like a heady wine, pine, rose, musk, and power. She had slipped away from her uncle's watchful gaze the moment the carriage rolled through the iron gates. Her plain gown of deep forest green was chosen not for elegance, but for how easily it could be shed in the dark. She was 23, born to a minor border pack on the edge of ruin, and tonight was her last night of freedom. Tomorrow, Uncle Bram would begin handing her over to Lord Silas, a cruel alpha twice her age, whose lands bordered theirs, sealing a pact that would keep their people fed through another harsh winter. Aloan refused to enter that cage while still carrying the fragile hope of choice. So, she had come here to the annual mating ball where masks hid identities and rules could be bent. Her gaze swept the swirling dancers until it caught him. He stood apart near the tall western windows, moonlight slicing across broad shoulders clad in unrelieved black. His mask was simple yet commanding, matte black covering the upper half of his face, leaving only a strong jaw, full lips, and eyes the color of storm-lit amber visible. No crown, no insignia. Their eyes locked across the floor. Something deep inside Aloan uncoiled, sharp, hungry, and undeniable. The mate bond? No. She had long since convinced herself that the goddess had skipped her when handing out such blessings. This was only lust sharpened by desperation. He crossed the floor in 3 strides, offering his gloved hand without a word. "May I steal you for a dance?" His voice was low, carrying the faintest edge of command that made her spine tingle. Aloan placed her hand in his before she could think better of it. "Only if you promise not to ask my name." A slow smile curved his lips. "Then we are even, because I have no intention of giving you mine." They danced, not the polite, measured steps of the court, but something more raw. His hand at the small of her back pulled her closer than propriety allowed. Her fingers curled into the fabric of his coat as the music swelled. Every brush of his body against hers sent sparks racing across her skin. She could smell him through the mask, dark cedar, winter wind, and something deeper she couldn't quite put her finger on. When the song ended, he didn't release her. Instead, he leaned down, his lips brushing the shell of her ear. "There are alcoves beyond the east corridor, private, no questions asked." Aloan's breath caught. This was what she had come for, reckless, anonymous release before her life was signed away. Yet her heart stuttered at the sheer intensity rolling off him. "Lead the way," she whispered before she could change her mind. He did. The alcove was small, draped in heavy velvet curtains that muffled the music to a distant heartbeat. Moonlight slanted through a narrow window, silvering the stone bench and the man who now towered over her. He removed his gloves slowly, revealing strong, calloused hands scarred from battles she could only imagine. "You've never done this," he murmured, reading her hesitation with unnerving accuracy. Aloan swallowed, her cheeks burning beneath her mask. "No. Not with anyone." Something shifted in his amber eyes, surprise, then a darker, possessive heat that made her knees weak. "Then I will be careful," he said softly. "But only if you still want this. Say the word, and I walk away." Aloan reached out, her fingers tracing the edge of his mask. "I want this. Just for tonight." He exhaled sharply as if her words had struck him, and then his mouth was on hers. The kiss started slow and exploratory, his lips firm and warm, tasting of spiced wine and restrained hunger. But when Aloan rose on her toes and parted her lips, inviting him deeper, the stranger's control fractured. He groaned low in his throat, one hand sliding into her hair to tilt her head back, while the other gripped her waist, pulling her flesh against him. Heat flooded her body. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times in the lonely nights leading here, quick, fumbling, transactional. This was none of those things. This was fire and storm, and the terrifying sense that she was being seen, truly seen, for the first time in her life. His hands moved with devastating patience, unlacing the back of her gown until the fabric pulled at her feet. Cool air kissed her skin, but his palms were blazing as they mapped her shoulders, the curve of her waist, and the swell of her hips. When he cupped her, his thumbs brushing sensitive peaks, Alowan gasped into his mouth, arching into the touch. "You're exquisite," he rasped against her throat, his lips trailing fire down to the hollow where her pulse hammered. She tugged at his coat, desperate to feel his skin. He helped her, shrugging it off along with his shirt, revealing a torso carved by war, a broad chest dusted with dark hair, ridges of muscle, and old scars that told stories she suddenly burned to know. Her fingers traced one long mark across his abs, and he shivered under her touch. Alowan pressed her lips to it, then lower, exploring with a boldness that surprised even her. She had only ever read about this in the romance novels she hid beneath her floorboards, tattered pages passed secretly between the younger she-wolves during long winter nights. Yet here she was, heart thundering, acting on pure instinct. As her fingers tugged at the laces of his trousers, he caught her wrist gently. "Not yet," he murmured. "You first." He lowered her onto the velvet-draped bench, kneeling between her thighs. His mask stayed on, adding to the delicious anonymity, but his eyes never left hers as he kissed his way up her inner thigh. When his mouth found her, Alowan gasped, her fingers tangling in his thick, dark hair. He was relentless, yet achingly tender. Every slow stroke and gentle pressure drew sounds from her she had never heard herself make. Pleasure built in deep, rolling waves, cresting higher than she had ever imagined possible. She shattered with a soft cry, her body arching off the bench as release swept through her like wildfire, leaving her trembling and breathless. Only then did he rise, shedding the last of his clothes. He was magnificent, strong and scarred, every line of his body carved by power and war. Alowan reached for him. He groaned, his hips jerking into her touch. "Easy," he groaned out. "Or this will end far too soon." He positioned himself at her entrance. "Last chance," he whispered, his forehead resting against hers, their masks almost touching. "Tell me to stop, and I will." "Don't stop," Alowan breathed. "Please." He pushed inside slowly, filling her with a burn that bordered on pain yet bloomed into something exquisite. When he was fully seated, they both stilled, their breathing ragged. Alowan felt impossibly full, connected in a way that went beyond bodies. The stranger's arms trembled as he held himself still, giving her time to adjust. "You feel like coming home," he whispered, his voice breaking on the words. Then he began to move. Alowan wrapped her legs around his waist, nails digging into his shoulders as pleasure rebuilt, sharper this time. His hips snapped harder, the bench creaking beneath them, the sound of their joining obscene and perfect in the small space. "Look at me," he commanded softly. She did. Amber eyes burned into hers through the slits of his mask, raw with something far more dangerous than lust, possession, wonder, and a hunger that felt eternal. When release claimed her again, it felt like waves of ecstasy ripping through her, clenching around him until he followed with a guttural groan, his body shuddering against hers. They stayed locked together, foreheads pressed, hearts thundering in unison. His hands stroked her hair with surprising gentleness. "Stay with me tonight," he murmured. "The ball lasts until dawn. Let me have you again." Alowan smiled against his skin, already feeling the stirrings of renewed desire. "Only if you keep the mask on," she replied. He chuckled darkly. "As my lady wishes." But as they moved together a second time, learning each other's bodies with hands and mouths and whispered praises, Neither of them noticed the faint golden glow that briefly lit the edges of their masks. Nor did they feel the threads of fate tightening around them, weaving a bond neither had sought, but both would soon be unable to deny. Aloan let herself fall, let herself believe for these stolen hours that she was not an omega being traded for grain and safety, but simply a woman wanted for herself. Afterward, they lay tangled on the velvet, her head on his chest, listening to the steady drum of his heart beneath the distant swell of music. His fingers traced idle patterns along her spine, gentle in a way that made her throat tighten. "You're shaking," he said quietly, pulling the edge of his discarded coat over her shoulders. "Just cold," she lied. Though the real tremor came from the way his steady voice wrapped around her like shelter she had never been allowed to want. He shifted, drawing her closer so her cheek rested more fully against his skin. "Then let me warm you." Aloan closed her eyes against the sudden sting of tears. She had come here braced for clumsy hands and quick regret, not this tenderness wrapped in strength, a stranger who seemed determined to give her more than she had asked for. The thought of her future, of Lord Silas's cold claim and her uncle's satisfied smirk, pressed at the edges of her mind, but she pushed it away. For these last hours, she would let herself have this. They moved together once more before dawn, slower still, every touch laced with the knowledge that the night was slipping away. When release found them both, it was quieter, deeper, like a secret they were sealing between their bodies. He held her through the aftershocks, breathing her in as though he could keep some part of her with him when the masks came off and the world returned. As the first grey light crept through the narrow window, he helped her back into her gown, lacing it with careful fingers that lingered at the small of her back. Aloan adjusted her mask one final time, suddenly reluctant to leave the cocoon of velvet and moonlight. "No names," she reminded him, though her voice wavered. She slipped from the alcove before the golden thread she had felt humming between them could tighten any further. The grand hall was emptying, masks coming off, laughter turning to weary farewells. Aloan moved through the thinning crowd like a ghost, heart still racing, body still humming. And she told herself it was enough, one perfect, anonymous night. A memory to carry into the cage waiting for her at home. The carriage wheels jolted over the rutted border road, each bump a reminder that home was drawing closer and freedom was slipping away. Aloan pressed her forehead to the cool glass, watching the pine forest blur past. 3 days had passed since the mating ball, yet every time she closed her eyes, she felt the velvet of his coat beneath her fingers, the steady drum of his heart beneath her cheek. Her skin smelled faintly of dark cedar and winter wind, no matter how many times she scrubbed in the icy stream during rest stops. When the carriage finally rolled through the sagging gates of Thornvale, Nyx was waiting on the porch of the cottage they shared. Her arms were crossed and one dark brow arched in that way that always meant trouble. The moment Aloan stepped down, Nyx's nose twitched. Her eyes widened, then sparkled with pure mischief. "Aloan," she whispered, darting forward and catching Aloan's wrist before she could slip inside. "You smell like pure trouble. Like the scene in the Shadowed Crown where the rogue lord pulls the disguised princess into the moonlit garden." "Hush." Aloan clapped a hand over Nyx's mouth, cheeks flaming as she dragged her friend through the door and slammed it behind them. The little cottage smelled of dried herbs and wood smoke, safe and familiar, yet suddenly too small for the secret burning under her skin. Nyx pried Aloan's fingers away, grinning like she'd discovered buried treasure. "Don't hush me. You went to the ball and you did it. You gave your first time to some masked stranger just like Lady Elo in Wings of Winter Flame? Tell me everything. Was he tall? Did he have that slow, dangerous smile? Did he drop to his knees like the pirate captain in Stormbound Hearts?" Aloan groaned, sinking onto the edge of her narrow bed and burying her face in her hands. "Nyx, please." It was nothing like the books. She peeked through her fingers, her voice softening despite herself. "It was better." Nyx squealed and dropped beside her, bouncing the mattress. "Better? Oh goddess, I need details. Did he say pretty things? Did he look at you like you were the only woman in the entire realm? Because in Chapter 7 of Veil of Ember, the hero. He called me exquisite, Aloan admitted, the words slipping out before she could catch them. He was careful. So careful. And when it hurt at first, he held still and whispered that I felt like coming home. Her voice cracked on the last part. She hadn't meant to say that much. Nyx's teasing melted into something softer. She reached out and tucked a loose strand of Aloan's hair behind her ear. You deserve that, you know. Even if it was only one night. Aloan swallowed hard. It can't happen again. Once Uncle Bram hands me over to Lord Silas, that's the end of choices. She stood, busying herself with folding linens that didn't need folding, trying to outrun the way her body still hummed at the memory of his eyes watching her come apart. But the humming didn't stop. Over the next few days, it only grew. Her scent had changed, richer, warmer, threaded with something wild that made the younger wolves in the pack glance at her twice and then look away quickly. She caught herself pausing mid-task, fingers drifting to the hollow of her throat where his mouth had lingered, remembering the low groan he made when she traced the scar along his ribs. At night, she dreamed of him. She woke flushed and restless, pressing her thighs together against an ache that refused to ease. Life in Thornvale, though, pulled her under its familiar weight. She rose before dawn to help with the livestock, ground herbs for the healer's stores, and mended cloaks worn thin by another brutal winter. Then the royal entourage arrived to seal final border treaties. Aloan stood with the rest of the pack on the frozen common, wrapped in her plain grey cloak against the biting wind. A silver mask had long since been hidden beneath her floorboards. The air vibrated with nervous energy. Banners of deep crimson and silver snapped overhead as the procession wound down the rutted road. She kept her gaze fixed on the snow at her boots, refusing to scan the riders. She had no reason to look for the stranger. He had been a masked face in a sea of them, a night that belonged to shadows and nothing more. She would never see him again. That was the entire point. But when the lead rider came into view, something in the way he sat on his horse, his cloak billowing behind him like spilled ink, made her glance up before she could stop herself. Her stomach dropped. Even at a distance, she recognized the line of his jaw, the breadth of his shoulders, and the way he moved as though the world arranged itself around him. No, it couldn't be. He rode closer, his posture straight and commanding, amber eyes sweeping the crowd with quiet authority. When his gaze found her, it locked, widening a fraction. Recognition slammed into her like a physical blow. The same eyes that had held hers through the slits of a matte black mask now stared at her in broad daylight. Aloan's breath froze in her lungs. The man who had knelt between her thighs and whispered that she was exquisite was no nameless stranger. He was King Cassian, the Alpha King of Eldrith, whose name had been whispered like a warning along every border for years. She felt the ground shift beneath her boots, the cold wind suddenly too sharp against her flushed skin. This was the king whose expanding realm had swallowed smaller packs whole, the same king her Uncle Bram had cursed over thin stew and watered ale. Yet she had given her first time, her only night of freedom, to the one man whose reputation made Lord Silas look almost tolerable by comparison. A wave of self-loathing crashed over her. How could she have been so reckless? Cassian reined in his horse a few paces away, the procession slowing around him. For one suspended heartbeat, the entire village seemed to hold its breath. Then he dismounted with fluid grace, his cloak settling around him, and strode forward until only a few feet separated them. His scent washed over her, and her traitorous body answered, a thrum of heat pooling low in her belly. Aloan's pulse thundered in her ears. For a single, searing moment, the world narrowed to just the two of them. Then Lord Silas stepped forward, breaking the spell, and the king's gaze shifted away first, polite and composed. She swallowed hard, forcing her expression into careful neutrality, while her stomach twisted with conflicting fury and longing. King Cassian, her Uncle Bram greeted, bowing low with deference. We are honored by your presence for the treaty negotiations and, of course, for the formal sealing of my niece's mating pact with Lord Silas tomorrow." Cassian inclined his head, every inch the sovereign, but Aloan caught the faint tightening of his jaw. "The treaties will be addressed in due course," he said, his voice carrying that same velvet edge she remembered from the dark. "As for the lady—" His gaze flicked back to her for the briefest instant, long enough for her heart to stutter before duty pulled it away again. "Matters of claim are more delicate than contracts." Lord Silas's heavy hand landed possessively on her shoulder, his fingers digging in. "There is no delicacy required, Your Majesty. The pact is sealed. She will make a fine addition to my household." Aloan kept her eyes lowered, her cheeks burning, every nerve screaming at the contrast. Silas's touch felt like chains. The memory of Cassian's hands, calloused yet gentle, trembling as he held himself inside her, felt impossibly like freedom. She hated how easily her body still yearned for the king, even while her mind spun with doubt. The contradiction made her dizzy, fear and desire twisting so tightly she could barely breathe. The reception that evening was held in the draughty great hall of the border keep. Torches flickered against stone walls, and tables groaned under what little finery Thornvale could muster: wilted winter greens, thin stew, and the last of the preserved wine. Aloan stood at Lord Silas's side in the gown her uncle had forced her into, deep crimson cut too low, a brand marking her as property. Silas's heavy hand rested possessively on her waist, his breath sour against her ear as he muttered about sealing the pact and the benefits she would soon provide. She kept her eyes down, every nerve alive with the knowledge that Cassian was somewhere in this room. She felt him before she saw him. The air shifted when he entered, lighter, charged, as though the torches burned brighter. Conversations dipped, heads turned. Aloan's pulse spiked. She risked a glance, and there he was, moving through the crowd with that same fluid grace. His black velvet coat was simple, yet somehow richer than any silk in the room. His gaze swept the hall once, then locked on her again. This time, he did not look away immediately. Amber eyes held hers across the distance, raw with the same wonder she remembered from the alcove, and something hotter: possession, longing, the quiet promise that the night had not been forgotten. Heat flooded her cheeks. She wanted to look away, to cling to the safe anger and doubt, but her body betrayed her, leaning imperceptibly toward him as though the golden thread between them had grown taut enough to pull. Silas's grip tightened, yanking her attention back. "Keep your eyes where they belong." The minutes stretched into an eternity of rising nerves. She felt Cassian's gaze on her, watching, waiting, while Silas's possessive hand roamed lower, squeezing her hip in silent claim. Her stomach churned with conflicting fire, revulsion at Silas's rough touch, helpless yearning for the king, and a sharp, bitter anger at herself for having walked so willingly into ruin. Then Cassian moved. He crossed the hall with deliberate, unhurried steps, the crowd parting around him as though commanded by an invisible hand. He stopped before them, his eyes softening the moment they met hers. "Lord Silas," he said, his voice low and smooth. "A word regarding the border accords." His gaze flicked to her uncle briefly, then returned to Aloan, lingering. "And perhaps the lady would honor me with a dance first, before we discuss terms." Silas's fingers dug harder into her waist. "With respect, Your Majesty, the lady is spoken for. The pact is sealed, and tomorrow—" "It is not yet tomorrow," Cassian interrupted, calm but unyielding. "One dance changes nothing, unless you fear I might steal her away with mere steps." A faint but dangerous smile touched his lips. "Surely a strong alliance can withstand a single turn around the floor." Silas's face darkened, but he could not refuse without causing a scene. With a stiff nod, he released her, though his glare promised retribution later. Aloan's heart hammered as Cassian extended his hand, the same hand that had once unlaced her gown with devastating patience. She placed her fingers in his, and the moment their skin met, the golden thread sang. Heat rushed up her arm as it had that night. Her mind recoiled. This is the king, the conqueror. You chose the worst man possible. While her body leaned closer, he led her onto the floor. More eyes turned their way with every step, whispers rippling like wind. The music swelled, slower and more intimate than the lively tunes earlier, and they moved together. His hand rested respectfully at the small of her back, guiding without possessing. "You're trembling again," he murmured, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "Just as you did that night when I first tasted you." Alowan's breath hitched. "I wasn't sure you recognized me," she managed. "And now that you have, I know I made a big mistake that night. I didn't know who you were." Something flickered across his face, hurt, quickly masked. His thumb stroked once over the back of her hand, small and secret. "You made no mistake. You chose with courage in the dark. I am the one who must prove I am worthy of that choice." His eyes held hers. "Let me show you the man who held you that night. Not the king the stories warn about. Just me." She wanted to believe him. But the fear remained sharp and real, clashing with the helpless draw of his warmth. Before she could answer, Silas pushed through the dancers, his face thunderous. "The dance is over," he growled, seizing her arm. "The lady has had enough excitement for one evening." Cashin's jaw tightened, but he released her carefully, his fingers lingering a heartbeat longer than necessary. "Until tomorrow, then," he said softly, his eyes never leaving hers. The promise in them made her chest ache. That night, back in the cramped healer's cottage, Nyx was already waiting when Alowan slipped through the door. A small pot of weak tea steamed on the table beside two chipped mugs, the fire banked low. The moment she saw Alowan, Nyx's face lit with bright delight. "You're back," she whispered, half rising from the stool. "I heard the royal party rode in today, and goddess, your scent is even stronger. Did you see him? Was the king really?" She stopped mid-sentence as Alowan's expression registered. The excitement drained from her eyes, replaced by quick, quiet worry. She crossed the room and caught Alowan's cold hands. "What happened? You look like someone just told you the world ends at dawn." Alowan let herself be pulled down onto the edge of the narrow bed. The tea mug was warm between her palms, but it did nothing to thaw the knot in her chest. "Here's the world ending, Nyx." The stranger from the ball. It was him. King Cassian, the Alpha King. Nyx's brows shot up, but she simply squeezed Alowan's fingers tighter, listening. "I gave my first time to the one man whose name makes every border pack bar their doors," Alowan continued, her voice cracking. "I've invited the storm into our pack. I feel like the biggest fool who ever lived." Nyx was quiet for a moment, her thumb rubbing slow circles over Alowan's knuckles, the way she always did when words weren't enough. Then she leaned in, resting her forehead lightly against Alowan's temple. "You're not a fool," she said simply. "You finally felt something real in the dark. That doesn't make you foolish. It makes you human." She pulled back just enough to meet Alowan's eyes. "I heard the whispers when the royal banners first appeared. People saying the king looked at you like you were the only soul in the village. If that's true, then maybe the storm isn't here to destroy everything. Maybe it's just here for you." Alowan's throat tightened. She leaned into her friend's warmth, the familiar scent of herbs and wood smoke grounding her when everything else felt like it was spinning. "Whatever happens tomorrow, you're not facing it alone," Nyx promised. "I'll be right here, reminding you that you're more than a bargaining chip." Alowan closed her eyes and let the simple comfort settle over her like a blanket. For a little while, the fear receded, leaving only the steady beat of her best friend's heart and the quiet knowledge that at least one person in this crumbling world still saw her as Alowan first. The next morning, the sky hung low and grey. Alowan stood in the great hall once more, dressed in the same crimson gown, her heart hammering as the official claiming ceremony loomed. King Cassian was nowhere to be seen. Lord Silas paced like a caged beast. Her Uncle Bram muttered threats under his breath, and every passing minute tightened the knot in her stomach. She told herself she was relieved, she told herself the night had been a mistake best forgotten. Then the doors swung open, and King Cassian strode in, his cloak sweeping behind him, his presence filling the room without effort. He stopped before the makeshift dais, his amber eyes finding hers with quiet intensity. "Before any claiming proceeds," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the hall, "I invoke the ancient right of first claim. The Lady Aloan Hartwell is already bound to me by the laws of the old moon. I claim her as my mate." The hall erupted. Lord Silas surged forward, his face purpling with rage. "You cannot simply declare." "I can," Cassian cut in, calm but unyielding. "The right is older than any contract signed in this keep. We met the night of the mating ball. She is already bound." Uncle Bram stepped beside Silas, his voice sharp with disbelief. "Bound by what proof?" "The girl was promised months ago, before the ball. The pact was sealed in blood and grain." Cassian's gaze never wavered. "The proof is written in the old laws themselves. First sight under the masked moon creates an unbreakable prior claim." Silas's laugh was ugly. "You expect us to believe you? The Alpha King somehow stumbled upon our border Omega at a ball, and she is now magically yours? This is theft dressed in ceremony." The room crackled with murmurs. Aloan stood frozen on the dais, her heart slamming against her ribs. Relief crashed through her so sharply it stole her breath. She would not belong to Silas. She would not spend her life as a bruised bargaining chip in his bed. Yet the words, "already bound," landed like fresh chains. She had given herself freely in the dark to a masked stranger, thinking it was her one night of choice. Now that choice had been claimed by a king, rewritten into law before she could even catch her breath. Cassian's voice remained steady. "I did not expect belief without incentive. The border treaties will favor Thornvale more generously than any previous offer, double the grain shipments for the next 5 winters, full protection from southern raiders along the ridge, and a permanent seat on the Northern Council for your pack's chosen representative." A stunned silence fell. Uncle Bram's eyes narrowed with greedy calculation, even as Silas's face twisted with fury. "You think you can buy her?" Silas spat. "She was promised to me. My lands border yours. This is an insult." "It is an offer," Cassian replied, his tone cooling. "One that keeps your people fed and safe while preserving peace. Refuse it, and the old right still stands. The choice is yours." Silas opened his mouth to argue again, but Uncle Bram laid a restraining hand on his arm, already tasting the doubled grain shipments. The hall waited, breath held. Cassian's gaze slid to Aloan, softening and protective. For one heartbeat, the noise faded, and it was only the two of them again, the same amber eyes that had watched her come apart in the alcove, now promising something gentler than conquest. She looked away first, her throat tight, torn between gratitude and the sharp sting of being currency. She was still being bartered, only the buyer had changed. The thought twisted painfully in her chest, freedom from one cage only to step into another, dressed up with favorable terms. "We will consider this unexpected offer, Your Majesty." Uncle Bram broke the silence, his voice measured. "We will give our final answer tomorrow, after we have discussed it properly." Cassian inclined his head once. "Tomorrow, then." Aloan could barely breathe. The moment the formalities ended and the crowd began to disperse, she slipped from the dais and fled through a side door, tears burning hot behind her eyes. She didn't stop until she reached the narrow balcony overlooking the snow-dusted pines, the cold wind whipping at her crimson gown like punishment. Footsteps sounded behind her, measured and unhurried. "Aloan," he called softly. She didn't turn. "Don't." Cassian stopped a respectful distance away. His voice was low, rough with regret. "I'm sorry. I never meant for it to happen like this, in front of everyone, with treaties and grain shipments. I hate that I had to use them at all." She laughed once, still facing the trees. You hate it? I gave my first time to a masked stranger because I wanted one night that was mine. And now my entire future is being negotiated like a trade route. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the wind. I have never stopped thinking of you, Cassian said quietly. Not for 1 hour since you left that alcove. I searched every face at court, every border village I rode through. You have haunted me, Aloan, in the best and worst ways. Aloan finally turned, tears tracking down her cheeks despite the cold. This will never work. You're the king. I'm a border omega who was just minutes away from being sold to a brute. We are not equals. We are not even from the same world. I know. He stepped closer but still left space, his amber eyes raw with honesty. That's why I'm asking for a chance. Come with me to the palace. Not as my prisoner, not even as my mate. Give me 1 week to court you properly, the way you deserve. Walk the gardens with me. Let me show you the man who hasn't stopped thinking of you since the moment you left the ball. If you still want your freedom, I will release the claim. No repercussions, no grudges. Safe passage anywhere you choose. You have my word. Aloan's breath caught. And what's in it for you? She asked, her voice trembling. A week of pretending with a woman you barely know? Cassian's expression softened, something aching breaking through the regal mask. For me? The chance to prove that the man who held you that night wasn't a lie. The chance to wake up every morning knowing I might get to see that same look in your eyes again, the one you gave me when you trusted me with your pleasure. His voice dropped, rough with quiet heartache. I would rather have 7 real days with you and lose you, than a lifetime wondering what might have been. The words landed like a caress and a wound at once. Aloan searched his face, fear and longing still at war inside her. Finally, she nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. 1 week. But I bring Nyx. She's the only family I have left. A small, genuine smile touched his lips, warm with relief. Then Nyx comes. She is welcome in my house. That final night, Aloan slipped through the shadowed corridors of the keep, unable to sleep. The stone was cold beneath her bare feet. She paused near a half-open door when low, satisfied voices drifted out, her Uncle Bram and Lord Silas speaking in the lazy cadence of men who had just won something. There was a soft clink of cups and a low chuckle. Double the grain in the council seat, her Uncle Bram was saying, his voice thick with satisfaction. We'll eat well this winter while he plays house with the girl. Clever move on our part, letting him think he's the one doing the saving. Silas's laugh rumbled, coarse and pleased. By the time it's done, she'll have served her purpose twice over. The king gets his pretty new toy, and we get everything we need. A chair scraped, and Aloan pressed herself against the wall, heart hammering, catching only the tail end of the next words. And when the real opening comes, she'll be perfectly placed to help it along. He won't see it until it's too late. The purpose behind the celebration was unmistakable. They had decided to accept Cassian's offer. The relief of escaping Silas should have felt sweeter, but it curdled in her chest. She was leaving the only home she had ever known, saying goodbye to the narrow paths she had walked in every season, to the stream where she had washed herbs at dawn, and to the small, stubborn life she had built despite everything. Yet even that grief was tangled with something darker, one line that refused to leave her alone, when the Real opening comes. It sounded like more than bruised pride or simple greed. She backed away silently, her heart racing. The journey north began at first light, the royal caravan winding out of Thornvale like a dark ribbon across the snow. Aloan rode in a covered carriage with Nyx, the heavy furs doing little to warm the chill that had settled deep in her bones. Cassian rode at the front on his massive black warhorse, his cloak snapping in the wind. But every few hours, he fell back to ride beside their window, finding excuses to check on them. On the second morning, Nyx leaned out the window during one of those visits. Your Majesty, if you're going to keep hovering like a worried hen, you might as well be useful. Aloan likes her tea with a pinch of honey and a slice of lemon, if you can find any. And she pretends she doesn't like poetry, but she cries every time the knight in Vale of Ember reads the starlit vow to Lady Elo. Just so you know. Cassion's lips twitched, the corner of his mouth lifting in a half-smile that made something warm unfurl in Aloan's chest. Noted, he said, his gaze sliding to Aloan. I'll remember the honey and the poetry. Aloan flushed and looked away, but she couldn't quite hide the small, reluctant curve of her own mouth. Nyx settled back against the cushions with a satisfied sigh. See? Even kings can be trained. At night, they stopped at way stations or inns, and King Cassian made sure Aloan and Nyx had the warmest rooms. He never presumed to join them, but each evening a small tray would appear, tea with honey and lemon, a single wildflower tucked beside the cup, or a carefully copied passage from one of the romance novels she loved, written in his strong, surprisingly elegant hand. One evening at a modest inn near the foothills, Aloan stepped onto the private balcony after Nyx had fallen asleep. Snow dusted the railings. Cassian was already there, leaning against the stone, 2 goblets of warm spiced wine in his hands. I thought you might be cold, he said simply, offering one. She took it, her fingers brushing his. The contact sent a spark racing up her arm, the same spark that had ignited in the alcove. Her body leaned toward him before her mind could stop it. She stopped and pulled back, gripping the goblet tighter. You don't have to do this, she said quietly. The flowers, the notes, the tea. It feels like you're trying to buy what you already claimed with treaties. Cassian set his own goblet down and turned to face her fully. The moonlight carved shadows across his strong jaw, highlighting the faint scar she had once traced with her lips. I'm not buying anything, Aloan. I'm courting you the way I should have from the beginning, if I'd had the courage to remove the mask that night and tell you who I was. His voice dropped. I want you to choose me. Not because of an ancient rite or doubled grain shipments, but because the man who held you in that alcove is still here, and he hasn't stopped thinking about the way you looked at him when you let yourself fall. Aloan's throat tightened. Part of her believed him, but the other part, the guarded survivor who had spent years bracing for the next blow, kept whispering that kings did not change for border omegas. The next night, they stopped at a larger inn with a clear view of the stars. Cassian had arranged a private corner of the courtyard, blankets spread over the snow, and a small fire glowing softly. Nyx had winked and disappeared inside with a mug of tea, leaving them alone. Aloan sat beside him, knees drawn up, the vast sky stretching above them. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Cassian reached into his coat and pulled out a small, worn book, Vale of Ember, the very one she and Nyx had read until the pages were soft. I asked every bookseller between Thornvale and the capital, he said, almost shy. I wanted the one you loved most. Aloan took it with trembling fingers. The cover was familiar, the edges worn. You remembered. I remember everything, he murmured. The way your breath caught when I first tasted you. The way you whispered please, like it cost you everything to trust me. I remember how you looked at me afterward. He turned toward her, his voice low. I want to be that man for you again, Aloan. Every day, not just for one stolen night. She met his eyes, the golden thread between them humming so loudly she could almost hear it. Her body wanted to close the distance, to feel his hands on her skin again, to let him take her apart with the same patience. But he held back, his jaw tight with restraint. I see the stories in your eyes sometimes, she whispered. The ruthless king who swallows packs whole. The conqueror they fear on every border. And then I look at you now, and I don't know which man is real. Both, he admitted, raw honesty flickering across his face. I have made hard choices to keep my realm from fracturing. But with you, I want to be different. I want to be the man who makes you feel safe enough to dream again. By the time the palace rose against the mountains, white stone and soaring towers gleaming under the winter sun, Alohan's walls had cracked but not fallen. The moment the heavy iron gates closed behind their caravan, she felt the weight of the palace settle over her like a second skin, grand, beautiful, and utterly foreign. Servants moved like silent ghosts through marble halls lined with ancient tapestries. Guards in silver and black livery bowed as King Cassian passed. Everything smelled of polished stone and the faint evergreen scent that always seemed to cling to him. Nyx was given rooms adjoining Alohan's, a kindness that eased the sharpest edge of her anxiety. But it was the colossal library that undid her the very first afternoon. She had wandered in alone, drawn by the faint scent of old paper and leather, and simply stopped breathing for a moment. Shelves soared 3 stories high, with spiral staircases of dark oak winding between them like the ribs of some ancient beast. Sunlight slanted through tall arched windows. Alohan stood in the center of the main reading hall, head tilted back, her heart aching with a longing so fierce it felt like grief. This was the kind of place she had dreamed about in the long winters when her uncle rationed candles and called books a waste for girls who would only ever be traded. Here, knowledge wasn't hoarded or hidden, it simply was. She drifted toward a long oak table near the tallest window, her fingers trailing over the smooth grain until they found an old atlas of the realm's borders. She opened it carefully, losing herself in yellowed maps and hand-drawn coastlines, tracing the thin lines that had once marked the fragile edges of Thornvale. She didn't notice the silver tray until it appeared beside her elbow, 2 honeycakes still warm from the oven, their glaze glistening beside a fresh pot of tea that smelled faintly of lemon and spice. Cassian arrived moments later, pretending surprise at finding her there, though the faint curve of his mouth betrayed him. "I was told the light in this room is particularly good for reading," he said, settling into the chair across from her with easy grace, "and that certain readers prefer their tea with a dangerous amount of honey." Alohan fought a smile. "Nyx has a big mouth." "She has excellent taste in friends," he replied, his eyes warm. "And she told me you once dreamed of opening a proper healer school here in the north, one that teaches anyone who wants to learn, not just those born to the right bloodlines." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping. "Tell me about that dream." So she did. For the first time in years, Alohan spoke aloud about the small, stubborn hopes she had buried under survival, training more healers, building stores of medicine that could survive harsh winters, and teaching young Omegas that their worth wasn't measured by who claimed them. Cassian listened without interrupting, his eyes never leaving her face. When she finished, he simply said, "Then we'll make it real. Not because you're mine, but because it's right." The words settled over her like sunlight. She wanted to believe him. Their moments together grew charged with a restraint he clearly fought to maintain. During a private stargazing night on a high tower balcony, wrapped in thick furs against the mountain chill, King Cassian lay beside her on a pile of cushions, close enough that their shoulders brushed. As the stars wheeled overhead, he turned his head toward her. "You make me want to be better than the stories say I am," he murmured. His hand lifted, hovering near her cheek, then settled instead on a loose strand of her hair, tucking it gently behind her ear. "Every time I'm near you, I remember how perfectly you fit against me that night. How you trusted me with something so precious," his voice roughened. "I want you, Alohan, more than I've wanted anything in my life. But I won't take what isn't freely given with your whole heart." The air between them thickened, heavy with unspoken want. Alohan's body leaned toward him instinctively, her lips parting on a shaky breath, but he only brushed his thumb along her jaw once before pulling back with visible effort. "Not until you choose me," he whispered fully. The slow burn left her restless at night, aching in ways that made her press her thighs together and remember the velvet alcove. Yet every restrained touch, every thoughtful gesture chipped away at the walls she had built to survive. He was showing her day by day that the man who had been so careful with her body could also be careful with her heart. Danger, however, did not wait politely. Small signs began to appear, riders from the south arriving at odd hours, and messages delivered to Cassian's study that left his jaw tight. One evening while walking the snowy gardens with Nyx, Aloan noticed two of Lord Silas's former retainers lingering near the outer gates, speaking in low voices before melting back into the trees when they spotted her. Cassian doubled the guard without explanation, but she caught the protective shadow in his eyes whenever he looked at her. Now Nyx noticed, too. "Something's brewing," she said one afternoon as they sat in the library, their voices hushed. "Cassian's different when those southern messengers come, sharper, all steel and storm, but the second he looks at you, it melts. I don't know whether to be impressed or terrified." Aloan traced the edge of an old map with her fingertip. "I think it's about me," she whispered, the fear slipping out before she could cage it. "Uncle Bram and Lord Silas aren't going to let this go without a fight." Nyx's hand took hers. "Then we make sure they never get close enough." Before Aloan could answer, the tall library door swung open with a soft creak. King Cassian stepped inside, snow still dusting his shoulders from whatever errand had taken him into the courtyard. His gaze found her instantly, softening the way it always did, but she caught the faint tightness at the corners of his eyes, the shadow of whatever news those southern riders had brought. He crossed to their table. "I thought I might find you here. The light is especially kind to maps this time of day." Aloan managed a small smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "It is, though some borders look smaller when you're safe behind palace walls." Cassian's brow furrowed. He pulled out the chair beside her, close enough that his knee brushed hers beneath the table. "What troubles you?" She hesitated, then met his gaze directly. "Uncle Bram and Silas, they accepted your terms too quickly. They are not the kind of men who swallow pride without planning to spit it back poisoned. I can feel it like a storm gathering just beyond the ridge." Cassian's hand covered hers on the table, his calloused palm warm and steady. "Then we face the storm together," he said quietly. "I won't let them use you as a weapon. Not while I still draw breath." Nyx cleared her throat lightly, breaking the tension with a wry smile. "Well, if we are preparing for war, I'm going to need more honey cakes and maybe a sharp dagger or two." Cassian's lips twitched with amusement. "I'll see what the kitchens can spare, and the armory." Aloan let out a shaky laugh despite herself. She was falling slowly, fearfully, but undeniably for the man who had once worn a mask and called her exquisite. And somewhere beyond the snow-covered mountains, her uncle and Lord Silas were no longer content to let her go. The real storm was gathering, and it was coming for all of them. It began with whispers in the council chambers, nobles who had once stood with Cassian now murmuring about the king's distraction and a border Omega weakening the throne. Silas and her uncle had not been idle, they had spent the weeks quietly gathering support, bribing minor lords with promises of land and influence, and exploiting old grudges against Cassian's reforms. King Cassian met the growing threats head-on, riding out at dawn to reinforce border patrols and returning exhausted. He sacrificed sleep, concessions, and lesser treaties, and even personal guard rotations to keep the palace secure, all without a single word of complaint to Aloan. There was only the quiet reassurance in his touch when he found her in the library each evening. One night, he returned from a long day in the saddle, snow clinging to his heavy black cloak, and found her waiting with warm wine and a plate of honey cakes. The moment the door closed behind him, he crossed to her, pulling her into his arms with a roughness born of deep exhaustion and relief. His forehead dropped to hers, his breath ragged. Without a word, he drew out a small, slightly crushed bouquet of wildflowers. They were hardy winter blooms she recognized instantly, their stems still carrying traces of dirt and frost. "I passed the meadows on my way back from the southern ridge," he said, his voice almost shy. "I thought you might like to remember what freedom smells like." Aloan took them, her throat tight with emotion. The faint scent of snow and hardy petals filled her lungs, carrying memories of running through tall grass before her Uncle Bram's shadow had fallen over everything. "You rode all the way back there after a full day of patrols?" she asked. He shrugged, a faint flush coloring the tips of his ears despite the cold. "It was on the way." His amber eyes met hers, raw and honest. "I wanted them to be real, not ordered from the palace gardens. The simple gesture undid her. She stepped into him, the flowers crushed between their bodies as she rose on her toes and kissed him, the slow burn of their connection igniting into something much fiercer. His hands came up to frame her face, his thumb stroking her cheeks as his mouth opened under hers, his tongue sliding against hers in a rhythm that made her knees weak. She pressed closer, feeling the hard line of his powerful body, yet marveling at the way his breath hitched when her hips brushed his. Heat flared low and insistent. Her fingers slipped beneath his cloak, tracing the warm skin at his waist, and he groaned into her mouth, backing her gently against the stone pillar behind them. For one dizzying moment, all control slipped. His hands slid down her sides, gripping her hips and pulling her flesh against him as the kiss turned hungry and desperate. Their teeth grazed and tongues tangled as the bond flared bright between them. Aloan felt herself tipping towards complete surrender, her body arching into his, a soft whimper escaping her as his thigh pressed between hers. Then the palace bells rang, sharp, urgent, and shattering the night. They broke apart, gasping for air. Cashin's eyes were dark with want and his chest was heaving, but the mask of the king was already sliding back into place. "Messengers," he said, his voice rough with intensity. "Southern border." Aloan nodded, still catching her breath, the flowers clutched and forgotten in one hand. They hurried inside together, Nyx already waiting in the corridor, her face pale with concern. The great hall was chaos when they arrived. Messengers in mud-splattered cloaks knelt before the dais, their voices overlapping in urgent, panicked reports. Lord Silas and her uncle Bram had rallied a small but well-organized force of disgruntled nobles and southern mercenaries. They had struck at a key border outpost under the cover of a false flag, their supply lines cut with surgical precision. Rumors were already spreading that the king had abandoned his realm for a border girl. Cashin's face hardened into the ruthless mask the stories warned about, his eyes sharp, his jaw set, and his voice clipped as he began to issue orders. As the reports continued to pour in, Aloan stood beside him in the war room, the map spread across the table like battle scars. When the last messenger left, she turned to him, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. "I'm coming with you when you ride out," she said. "My wolf is strong, Cassian. Stronger than I look. I spent years surviving on the border while others decided my fate. I'm not waiting behind stone walls while you bleed for me." He cupped her face, his thumb brushing her cheek with aching tenderness, but his eyes held the weight of every hard choice he had ever made. "I can't risk you, Aloan. Stay here. Stay safe. I will come back to you." The last wall inside her finally broke. "No," she said, her hands fisting in his coat. "I've spent my whole life having someone else decide my fate. You've taught me I don't need to do that. So, let's prove it. Let's fight this together." Cashin's breath caught. For a heartbeat, he simply looked at her, raw and wondering, with the same look he had given her in the alcove when she had trusted him with her pleasure. Then he pulled her close, kissing her. It was deep and desperate, both a promise and a plea, his hands sliding into her hair as though he could memorize the feel of her before the storm broke. They rode out at dawn with a full company of Cashin's personal guard, 24 elite wolves in silver and black livery, their horses snorting steam into the frigid air. Cassian rode at the head on his massive black warhorse, his cloak snapping in the wind. Aloan rode beside him on a steady grey mare. Nyx mounted behind one of the younger guards, a borrowed blade strapped to her thigh and a determined glint in her eye. The bond between Aloan and Cassian hummed like a live wire. Every glance, every brush of their knees as they rode, left them charged with everything they had not yet said. The border outpost lay a day's hard ride south. Tension crackled through the column, the snow muffling their hoofbeats, but not the weight of what waited ahead. Cassian kept close, his gaze flicking to Aloan with quiet protectiveness. Dusk bled across the pines when Lord Silas's forces struck. They came from the trees, well-planned and coordinated, mercenaries and disgruntled nobles pouring from the shadows with steel and arrows. The first volley whistled through the air. A guard to Alowan's left cried out as a shaft took him in the shoulder. Cassian roared a command, his sword flashing free as he wheeled his horse. The company shifted instantly, forming a defensive ring. But the ambush was brutal and fast. Steel clashed against steel, the white snow turned crimson, and shouts echoed off the frozen trunks. King Cassian fought like the storm. He was ruthless and precise, every strike calculated to protect the center where Alowan and Nyx rode. But the numbers were against them. A mercenary broke through the line, his blade arcing toward Alowan's mare. Cassian spun, taking the blow across his own ribs instead. The steel sliced deep, and blood bloomed dark against his cloak. He staggered in the saddle but did not fall, his teeth bared in a snarl that was pure alpha. Alowan's world narrowed to the sight of him bleeding for her. The fear that had kept her guarded for so long shattered like ice under a spring thaw. She could no longer deny herself, she loved him. She loved the man who had trembled while holding her, the king who had listened to her dreams of better lives for her people, and the one who would sacrifice everything to keep her safe. Together, she shouted, her voice breaking with the force of her choice. She slid from the saddle, hitting the snow. The shift tore through her, bones reshaping and fur rippling silver-gray across her skin. Her wolf was not the largest, but she was clever and fast. She was agile on her paws, darting low and weaving between legs with the quickness born of years surviving on the border. Nyx shifted beside her, smaller and russet-furred but no less fierce, slipping under a mercenary's guard to hamstring him with sharp teeth before dancing away. Cassian roared and shifted with them, his massive wolf form golden-brown and towering, his amber eyes blazing. He slammed into the front line, his jaws closing on one attacker's arm and flinging him aside like a ragdoll. The three of them moved as one. Cassian's raw power carved a path, while Alowan and Nyx used speed and cunning to strike from the flanks, nipping at heels, dodging blades, and creating openings that the guards exploited with disciplined strikes. A blade grazed Nyx's shoulder, she yelped but kept moving. An arrow whistled toward Alowan, and she twisted mid-leap, the shaft slicing only fur. Cassian took another hit across his flank to protect her, blood matting his golden coat. Yet he never slowed, always placing himself between her and the worst of the fray. Lord Silas himself broke through the chaos on foot, his sword raised and his eyes wild with fury. He lunged straight for Alowan, his voice carrying over the din. "You think you can hide behind him forever," he snarled, his blade swinging in a vicious arc. "You were mine to break. You still are." Alowan dodged, her paws kicking up snow. Her heart was pounding but her mind was clear. She circled him low and fast, remembering every winter she had survived by being quicker than the men who thought they owned her. "I was never yours," she growled, the words distorted through her wolf's throat but unmistakable. "And I will never be anyone's to break again." She feinted left, then darted right as Silas overcommitted. Her jaws closed on his sword arm, sharp enough to make him scream and drop the blade. Nyx was there in an instant, a russet blur slamming into his legs from behind and sending him sprawling into the snow. Cassian finished it, lunging forward and pinning Silas beneath one heavy paw, his fangs bared at the man's throat. "Yield." Cassian snarled, his voice more beast than man. Silas spat blood, his eyes blazing with hate even in defeat. "She'll never be enough for you," he spat. Only a border omega who spread her legs for the first masked. Alowan shifted back to human form in a ripple of silver light, standing over him with snow in her hair and fire in her eyes. She looked down at the man who had once thought he could own her and spoke with the quiet, unshakable strength of someone who had finally chosen herself. "I spread my legs for a man who saw me," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Not for power, not for grain, and not for a title, but for someone who made me feel wanted instead of traded. That's something you will never understand, Silas, and it's why you've already lost." Silas's face twisted with rage. Even pinned beneath Cassian's massive paw, he lifted his chin, his arrogance cracking but not broken. You think this ends with me bleeding in the snow? He spat, his eyes flicking to Cassian. I'll make you a better offer, Your Majesty. Keep the grain shipments. Keep the council seat. Just give me the girl for one night. I'll break her in properly, then return her suitably obedient. You can have your pretty mate back once she knows her place. Every king needs a well-trained. Cassian's growl ripped through the air like thunder. His wolf lunged, his jaws snapping shut inches from Silas's throat in a warning that vibrated through the snow. Speak of her like that again, he snarled, and I'll tear your tongue out before I end you. Silas's remaining mercenaries broke then, fleeing into the trees like rats abandoning a sinking ship. The masterminded plot crumbled under the weight of the love they had underestimated and the clever fight they had not planned for. Silas, still on the ground, saw his last chance. He pushed himself up on one elbow, his face slick with sweat and blood, and his voice turned to a desperate plea. Wait, Your Majesty. Please. I can still be useful. I have contacts in the south, names, roots. Let me live and I'll give you everything. Just spare me. I'll swear loyalty. The plea was a distraction. His free hand darted to his belt, his fingers closing around a small but dark vial. With a snarl of triumph, he hurled it straight at Alowan, the poisoned glass glinting in the moonlight as it was aimed to shatter against her chest. Cassian's wolf reacted in a blur of golden fur, his jaws closing around the man's throat in one clean, lethal snap. Silas's scream died in a wet gurgle. The vial spun into the snow, shattering harmlessly several feet away, its dark liquid hissing against the white powder. Cassian held the bite for a heartbeat longer, ensuring the threat was ended, then released the lifeless body and shifted back. Blood streaked his side and flank, but his eyes found Alowan immediately, raw, protective, and full of love. He dropped to his knees in front of her, his hands moving over her with urgent care. His fingers skimmed her arms, her shoulders, and the shallow cuts along her ribs where a mercenary's blade had grazed her during the chaos. The wounds were light and already clotting, but he still pressed his palm gently over each one as though he could will them away. You're hurt, he breathed. His thumb traced a thin line of blood on her forearm, his eyes darkening with quiet fury at the sight. I'm all right, Alowan whispered, catching his hand and pulling it to her heart so he could feel the steady, thrumming beat beneath her ribs. I choose you. I've been choosing you every day since the alcove, even when I was too afraid to say it aloud. King Cassian exhaled a long, shaky breath, leaning his forehead against hers as the adrenaline finally began to recede. Around them, the survivors of the guard were rounding up the remaining mercenaries. Uncle Bram was found cowering behind a fallen log, his face pale with the realization that his gamble had failed. He was bound in heavy silver chains, stripped of his title and lands for treason against the crown and the cold betrayal of his own kin. The journey back to the palace was slower, marked by the quiet camaraderie of a pack that had bled together. Cassian refused to leave Alowan's side, his horse walking close enough that he could reach out and touch her hand every few miles, his thumb stroking over her knuckles in a silent, grounding rhythm. Once back within the safety of the white stone walls, the healing began in earnest. Alowan spent her days in the library and the infirmary, using the knowledge she had hoarded for years to treat the wounded guards. Nyx was always nearby, her russet hair tucked into a practical braid as she assisted with bandages and tinctures, her laughter returning as the shadow of Silas faded. On the final night of the promised week, Cassian requested Alowan's presence in his private study. The room was warm, lit by a roaring fire that cast long shadows across the rows of books. He stood by the window, looking out over the moonlit peaks, his posture less like a king and more like the man she had met in the dark. When she entered, he turned, holding a single piece of parchment sealed with the royal crest. The week is over, Alowan, he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of his promise. This is your official release. The right of first claim is dissolved. You are a free citizen of Eldrith, with enough golden land in the north to live however you wish. You never have to see me again if that is what your heart desires. Aloan looked at the paper, then at the man who had fought beside her in the snow. She took the parchment and, without a moment's hesitation, tore it in half. "I don't want freedom from you, Cassian," she said, stepping into the warmth of his space. "I want the freedom to be with you. To build the school we talked about. To see the man beneath the crown every single day." He didn't wait for her to say more. He crossed the room in 2 strides, lifting her off her feet and kissing her with a ferocity that spoke of months of held-back longing. Spring came slow to Eldrith, melting the snow into rushing rivers and painting the meadows in wild color. Aloan stood on the wide stone steps of the new healer school she had helped design. Young wolves moved through the halls with satchels of herbs and scrolls. Nyx stood beside her, arms crossed, a proud grin on her face. "You did it," Nyx said. "No more rationing candles or hiding books under floorboards. They get to learn. They get to dream." A warm hand settled at the small of Aloan's back. Cassian stepped up behind her, pressing a kiss to her temple. "They're already calling it the Cassian School of Healing," he murmured. "But I told them it should bear your name. You built this, not me." Aloan leaned back against his chest, her heart full. "We built it together." Later that night, in the quiet intimacy of their shared chambers, the moon spilled silver across the silk sheets. Cassian moved with the same devastating patience she remembered from the beginning, his hands mapping her body as though he were memorizing a sacred text. "You know," he murmured against her ear, his voice dropping into that velvet tone that still made her shiver. "I've been thinking about that alcove again. The way you looked at me when you let yourself fall." Aloan smiled against his throat, her fingers sliding beneath his shirt to trace the scars she now knew by heart. "And I've been thinking about how patient you were, how you held back even when I could feel how much you wanted me." She nipped lightly at his jaw, her voice turning playful and heated. "You don't have to hold back tonight, my king." Cassian groaned, the sound low and hungry, rolling them so she was beneath him. His mouth found hers in a deep, possessive kiss, his hands roaming with the confidence of a man who knew every inch of her, and still marveled at the gift. "Careful," he whispered against her lips, his eyes dark with desire. "I might never let you up again." Aloan wrapped her legs around his waist, pulling him closer. "Promise?" "Forever," he vowed, before his mouth took hers once more, sealing a bond that no treaty or sword could ever break.